My name is Emmanuel Marfo. I work as a senior research scientist at the Forestry Research Institute of Ghana, and as a research team leader on the EU chainsaw project that is being implemented in Ghana and also in Guyana. I would like to share few thoughts about the topic effective stakeholder participation, mainly focusing on the lessons that we have learned through many processes that we have been engaged in Ghana, and my own scholarly work on the topic of participation, and particularly focusing on community and civil society participation in these processes. And so I would like to structure my presentation in three main ways. First, to look at participation, what it means, and other conceptual issues that come up, especially when you talk about effective stakeholder participation. Then I'll focus on lessons that we have learned in Ghana, mainly through processes like the FLECT VPA process, the readiness preparation process in Ghana, and also the multi-stakeholder dialogue process that we employed in Ghana to, as it were, debate and to try to find solutions to the problems that we are talking about in the area of illegal chainsaw milling in Ghana. So first of all, let's focus on some of the conceptual issues. Participation. In the development literature, we all know that participation has been used to describe processes of stakeholder engagement. And the aim usually is to bring different stakeholders together, people with different interest groups together, to share their opinions about a certain problematic issue and maybe to find solutions together. And this is a paradigm shift from what used to be where central state or government agencies who were mainly in charge of policy planning and implementation usually did things on their own with a certain level of technocratic centered approach of doing things. And as the development issues come up, the development literature seems to have suggested that that way of doing business is not the best way, and that the best way to do business as far as trying to manage natural resources is concerned is to try and get the multiple stakeholder groups together. For people to share their views, we need to have extensive consultations and so on. Participation has become a very key feature of all interventions in environmental and natural resource development processes. Now, the question of participation also brings to mind the fact that participation in itself is a political process, and that usually you have higher level authorities who are designing participatory processes, making choices and recognizing certain categories of actors that they usually label as stakeholders. So The term stakeholder itself has been criticized or critiqued in some works because there has been an argument that stakeholder itself is a political choice, and that it is constructed, it's a social construct that is designed by higher level authorities who are designing participatory processes, and sometimes they define who, or they decide who a stakeholder is and who is not a stakeholder. And so in general, you find that when there is a certain level of social consensus on who the important actors are, or who should be involved and who should not be involved, we categorize these people as stakeholders. But again, when you follow the development literature, you would find that people or scholars have been talking about the fluidity of certain constructions that we use. For example, communities or civil society. In many cases, what constitutes civil society participation or community participation is nice theoretically, but in practice is difficult. And that fluidity is something that we also like to share some ideas on when it comes to the lessons that we have learned in our case study. But the question of effectiveness is very important to the extent that when we look at stakeholders and their participation, we are also talking about a larger constituency that is beyond the specific program that we have designed. For example, if we say that we have designed a program for VPA or flat VPA consultation, or illegal chainsaw milling consultation, or readiness plan or strategy development consultation, and we are inviting stakeholders, all the categories of actors that we intend to invite are, or those people who come with the label of stakeholders are also representing a certain larger constituency. So when you talk about communities, you cannot bring all the communities fringing all the forest together. You definitely need to bring some people who will represent them. When you talk about private sector, industry, you cannot bring all those who are processing timber in the whole sector together. When you talk about government, you cannot bring all the ministries and all the agencies of government together at a point. So participation necessarily invokes a certain sense of representation of a certain category of actors together. Now, what will make participation effective from my point of view is when that participation is resulting in democracy outcomes that the larger constituencies that are intended to be part of the whole process, their views and their concerns are well articulated and they are well represented, and on top of that whatever outcomes are generated from the dialogue process is feedback to the larger constituency. Now, in the main development literature and in governance literature of late, we have called that democratic representation. That is looking at the political dimension of participation, that the represented must be able to influence the process through their representatives, and that whatever outcome that is generated also gets back to those who are represented. representing these groups. So democratic representation, when it happens, is when participation will deliver democracy outcomes. Because at the end of the day, what is effective participation is the democracy, the liberal notions of people's involvement, and that's the uptake of people's voice to influence a certain action that is desired. So from my point of view, democratic representation is a necessary, is necessary for effective participation to be achieved. Now, having said that, I will also say that the essential elements of democratic representation are basically two: responsiveness and accountability. These are the two essential features of democratic representation. Responsiveness talks about the relationship between the representative and the larger constituency, and the extent to which the voice or the position or the interest that they are negotiating or articulating in the engagement process is reflecting the larger concerns of their people. And so you would expect that somebody who is participating in a stakeholder process, engagement or participatory process for industry, will be talking about things that will reflect what the industry's position is. Or when we say that somebody is a community representative, the person is expected to be talking about something that will reflect what the communities actually desire or want in the process. If that responsiveness element gets missing, then the participation is more or less a private engagement, that the individual who is a representative will be talking about things from his own perspective, or from his, in some scholars will call it that they will be officializing a private incident, and that their private opinions will be taken as official positions of their constituency, and that does not bring out or produce the democracy effect where citizens or the larger constituency are able to shape policy decisions and policy engagements. And so responsiveness is a key element to effective participation. The second aspect is accountability. Now, accountability is also important because those representatives who are representing these larger stakeholder groups need to get back to them on whatever assignment, so to speak, they were given to perform. And there must be sanction mechanisms in place that will compel these representatives to be able to live up to expectation. So in a nutshell, I'm saying that for us to talk about effective participation of stakeholders, we are not just limiting ourselves, or we should not just limit ourselves to the event of bringing the stakeholders together and people having the capacity to articulate their views and dialogue and negotiate and have all the nice, fanfares about participation process. And then at the end of the day, we document this in videos and probably say that there was stakeholder participation, without paying attention to the relationship between those who sat on the table and their larger constituency. And that is where, from that angle, I'm looking at the concept or the notion of effectiveness. And so what I've said in a nutshell is that effective stakeholder participation must mean democratic representation of different stakeholder groups. And by democratic representation, I mean the condition where representatives are responsive to their constituencies and they are accountable to them. Now, these two processes, in addition to the actual events put together, would mean that effective participation is a process and not an event. And therefore, I am calling for a change of mindset from where we organize events, bring people together, label them, give them labels that this person is a community member is because he's coming from the local place, this person is a private sector, this person is government, this person is civil society, and then bringing them together to have a nice facilitation process and everybody talks and all that. And then at the end of the day, when we are able to have a nice discussion, we conclude that there has been effective stakeholder participation. We need to move from that construction to a construction that looks at what happens between those who sit on the table and those who are at the background. To what extent are these stakeholders being responsive, and to what extent are they being accountable? And to design an effective stakeholder participation process, we need to build in mechanisms that allow for these different representatives to be responsive and to be accountable. And this calls for, or this means that effective stakeholder participation will necessarily involve some transaction costs. And in most cases, the transaction cost of representatives being responsive and accountable are discounted. They are not factored into project and program designs. So when higher level authorities are designing stakeholder dialogue or participatory processes, they only budget for the event of when we will bring the stakeholders. So how much it will cost local reps or civil society reps or government reps to be here, how much the accommodation will cost, how much the center, the venue will cost, and all that. And then when we have finished that, we discount what happens to the stakeholder before he comes to the meeting. To what extent are we able to make provision for him to be responsive? And to what extent are we making provision for him to be accountable? And these are the issues that from the literature and from our own work, we have seen that in most cases they are not taken into consideration. So I'm going to share some lessons that we have learned in Ghana with you. And I'm going to base my presentation on a number of initiatives that have gone on or are going on in Ghana and the lessons that we have learned. First of all, I'll talk about the social responsibility agreement. The social responsibility agreement is a policy that requires all timber concessionaires to negotiate a social responsibility with local communities. So that is one level of participatory process that local people are able to influence, for example, the content of what projects must go to their communities. That social responsibility agreement negotiation has been well studied in Ghana by myself and a couple of other researchers, and the lessons that we have learned will inform the general lessons that I'll share with you. The second process will be the VPA, the FLECT VPA consultation process. In Ghana, when we were negotiating the VPA, there was a requirement to do extensive consultation with civil society and local people. And we followed the consultation process. We have documented some lessons learned, and that will also inform the lessons that I would like to share with you. The third one is the RED, the reducing emission from deforestation and degradation process in Ghana. Ghana subscribed to the RED process and was required to develop what they call the readiness paper, and that consultation process has also been studied in terms of how participatory it was, and we also share lessons from that. And now we are the final thing is also about our own project, the EU Chainsaw Project, engaged, or we employed the multi-stakeholder dialogue, what we call the MSD, which was designed to be a platform to bring all stakeholders together to debate and to discuss issues that are related to illegal chainsaw milling in Ghana, with a view to finding solutions or policy options that could be employed to address the issues of illegal chainsaw milling in Ghana. That multi-stakeholder dialogue process has also been studied, and we have documented lessons on how effective it has been in terms of what I've already shared with you in terms of stakeholder participation. And now we are putting all these lessons together because we are at a point where we are trying to institutionalize multi-stakeholder dialogue as a way of doing things in the forestry sector. Ghana has come to a point that we more or less have chosen a path that all policy decisions in the forestry sector will be developed through a multi-stakeholder dialogue process. And so we are kind of institutionalizing stakeholder collaboration, and we are institutionalizing stakeholder consultation process. So we are drawing lessons from all these processes in order to fashion out an institutional mechanism that will help us to be able to implement multi-stakeholder dialogue in a way that will deliver the desired democracy outcomes. So these are the main lessons that I would like to share with you based on the various studies that we have conducted on all these processes. The first lesson that we have learned is that participation in practice has been reduced to organization of events with a list of participants labeled with different stakeholder categories, and that is it. When that has ended, we say that there has been participation, and that is not delivering democracy outcomes. The processes that we have studied, the lesson that we have learned is that in most cases, if not in all cases, the representatives who attended most of these engagement, so-called stakeholder participatory process, never reported outcomes of the meetings back to their larger constituency. In most cases, there is no pre-meeting engagements to even find out from their larger groups what positions they should take. So effectively, participation of stakeholders in all these processes we are talking about in Ghana has been reduced to private engagement, because it has become people's projects, people's own meetings, and that it is never something that is owned by the larger constituency. Even for those who come from state and government institutions or well-organized institutions, in most cases the reports do not get back to the bigger group. Officers are assigned programs, and so, for example, somebody will be assigned the duty to be involved in the project or involved in a VPA process or an MSD process, and that person will go and come without necessarily going to articulate the views of their agency or their institution. And that is why we conclude that most of these engagements have been reduced to kind of private assignments, more or less. And that is leading to elitism, in a sense that people become experts, so to speak, in particular participatory processes, to the extent that without them, their larger group or institution are not even able to participate in the process again, because there are no formal ways of getting the positions they articulated or even getting the feedback. In most cases, reports or minutes of such meetings end up in their own custody without going to this. So there's no institutional learning from the engagements that these people have had, and so they become experts in their own way. In a way, and in some cases, for example, in Ghana, those experts, those who have become experts in that sense, are the same people who are always consulted when it comes to the next consultation process for civil society, because they seem to have been the guys who know about the subject matter, and by extension they become more or less experts in the field. Now, another lesson is that even higher level authorities who are designing these participatory processes themselves do not have a clear understanding of what it should mean in practice. We have interviewed a number of experts who have designed the RED process, VPA consultation process, and all that. And when you ask a very simple question, what do we mean by participation? Their answers put together seem to, or effective participation, their answers put together seems to end up in effective dialogue. And therefore, they are not even contemplating participation beyond the event of sitting together to discuss. They are not contemplating responsiveness as an aspect of participation. And sometimes they talk about accountability, but they don't talk about it more forcefully, to the extent that it will suggest that it is something that they take it as a very serious aspect of the whole stakeholder participation process. And this has affected the way allocation of resources are also designed. Because if these higher level authorities do not contemplate responsiveness and accountability as part of what will make participatory processes effective, then they do not also budget for it. And therefore, it is not surprising that, for example, in the RED consultation process in Ghana, there was no budget for stakeholders who are participating in these consultation processes to even do a pre-meeting engagement or to do a post-meeting engagement to be able to send feedback to their larger constituency. And therefore, the submission is that we need to rethink participation from the perspective of democratic representation, so that higher level authorities who are designing these processes would aim at achieving citizen engagement. And by citizen engagement, we mean the larger constituency that have been categorized into so-called stakeholder groups will be able to shape the content of whatever that participation process will come out with. Without that, people will not own decisions that are taken, because even though their representatives participated in those meetings that developed whatever guidelines or outcomes or whatever output that came up, at the end of the day, they will not have any ownership, because the decision may not mirror, they may not see themselves in the decision. So there is effectively a kind of gap between stakeholder representatives and the larger constituencies. And therefore, that is an important thing that we need to do. Another difficulty or lesson that we have learned with stakeholder participation has got to do with the construction of the group itself and who should represent the group, particularly when you talk about civil society and community. These are problematic constructions, because in Ghana's case, you have over 90 NGOs who call themselves green NGOs, who work in the forestry sector. You have thousands of communities surrounding all kinds of gazetted forests. Now, so when you talk about civil society, who exactly are we talking about? And therefore, who represents such a large number or a large cluster of people that we have artificially labeled them civil society? You have NGOs, you have CBs, community-based organizations, you have the academia, people who are doing freelance research, you have all manner of people. So how do we guarantee their participation? The lesson we have learned is that the higher level authorities have often taken an easy step of going for mobilized groups. So for example, in Ghana, we have what we call the Forest Watch Ghana, which is supposed to be a coalition of some NGOs working in the forestry sector. And because they have been able to organize themselves into a coalition, they have been recognized as representing civil society. And in most cases, when we talk about civil society representative, we are always talking about the guys who represent the Forest Watch Ghana, for example. And rightly so, because it is extremely difficult for program designers or higher level authorities to go to the ground and kind of mobilize people into a group before they will select a representative to participate in a multi-stakeholder process. And so the convenient thing to do is to go to organizations that have already mobilized themselves. And there are also elites, people who have been active in the NGO circles, who have voiced out their opinions about things in the past, and who have gained a certain legitimacy as civil society leaders. And these are people that are always also falling on to represent civil society. But the problem is that, again, when you look at the process from democratic representation perspective, you ask yourself, to what extent are the issues that they are articulating representing the aspirations of what the broader civil society group is thinking, and to what extent are they being held accountable? There has been studies in Ghana that have shown that the NGOs are not necessarily accountable, and that they are not even necessarily democratic in terms of their own internal arrangements. And we see that also even in the case of the FLECT VPA and the RED consultation process in Ghana, where the representatives of civil society who were even elected were no longer providing feedback. And the observation is that sometimes they become an extension of the state, an extension of the official government system, because they gain a certain legitimacy. They now walk in the corridors of public offices, and in most cases they may even compromise their positions in terms of what they started with, or what the broader civil society group may be saying and what they are saying. That is also a problem. Now, the difficulty that we have seen with that is that this kind of recognition maintains the hegemony of, let's say, the dominance of traditional authorities and these so-called civil society elites. It creates a certain hegemony that in itself does not allow democracy outcomes to be delivered through this participatory process. So, for example, you have the higher level authorities recognizing chiefs and just assuming that these traditional authorities or chiefs are also representatives of their people, even though it is well documented that chiefs are not necessarily democratic, they are not necessarily representative of the local populations, and that in most cases they have even become an extension of the state, going back to the indirect rule system and all that. So we are talking about effective participation, and the lessons that we are learning is that it is not a question of whether the engagement was successful or not, or whether we were able to have a nice dialogue or not. We are talking about those who sit in the table. Who are they representing? What voice down there are they representing? Whose interests are they articulating? And to what extent are they providing feedback to the larger constituency? From that perspective, I would say that the lessons that we have learned, even through our RED process, even through our multi-stakeholder dialogue process, seems to suggest to us that level of effectiveness has not been achieved. However, I should also mention that the MSD process that we have employed in the Chainsaw Project to some extent is meeting this aspiration halfway, especially because we have the district level MSDs, which are the platforms where the national level dialogue outcomes feed back into the larger stakeholder, multi-stakeholder groups at the district level, at the local level. So that kind of system is providing some level of feedback, which to some extent is good. But the other processes that do not have that kind of lower level structures where there's a feedback which provides a feedback mechanism, we find that in most cases participation becomes, as I have said, something that they just do, and then we write nice reports, paste nice group photographs at the back, have a list of participants with their labels from different stakeholder categories. But we need to ask ourselves, to what extent are these kinds of workshops reflecting the opinions and the aspirations of the larger group that they are representing. The other lesson that probably we can talk about on civil society participation, because that's a very important aspect. It is a growing area. It is an area that the World Bank and all the development agencies have been talking about. But in the preparation of their program documents, they already talk about it, that you must involve all stakeholders, including indigenous people, including civil society, without themselves even knowing exactly what they talk about involving these people. Now, in Ghana, for example, when you look at the VPA, we call it the Timber Validation Council, which is supposed to be a body that is set up to manage the whole VPA process, or its implementation for that matter. The law asks for civil society representation on the council, and the law specifies the the Trades Union Congress, which is a Congress of Labor, to represent civil society. In practice, this has never been implemented because the conventional practice has been that the forestry officers or public officers have always used these civil society groups like the Forest Watch, the Forest Watch Ghana, and these elites, so-called civil society elites, who have come up. And so once the law specifies, but the practice is different, the officers tend to use these guys that they know. And in fact, there's a struggle between the Forest Watch Ghana, for example, their recognition, because they think that they have not been recognized by the law as the representative of civil society, and that the Trades Union Congress, which is a labor group, has nothing to do with forestry issues. But then the drafters of the law thought that they wanted to be unambiguous, and that is why they go for an established institution that has some legitimacy or some level of recognition in government circles or in the eyes of the public. So there's also a dispute between what the law says and what people in the forestry sector are comfortable with. And that dispute has to be resolved. And it can only be resolved if there are mechanisms that establishes that representatives are responsive and accountable. But these are difficult challenges. I wouldn't say that we have been able to overcome these challenges, especially with civil society and community participation, because you are talking about a large number of communities and you don't know who can represent them effectively in terms of who can articulate all their concerns and who who can give a feedback to them. And so that is the challenge that we are facing also in Ghana, and I believe that other people elsewhere may be facing the same problem, because in the literature there's an increasing critique about civil society, about the whole notion of civil society and the claims of being the right people to represent communities and being more democratic, and especially when donor funds are now going to them directly. People begin to question whether they are even more responsive to the local people than government, or whether they are more accountable to local people than government. In Ghana, there has been a recent publication that has suggested that NGOs are not necessarily more accountable and more democratic to governments. So now, my final thoughts on all these, perhaps my take-home message. I'll make 4 key points. The first is that I will argue that democratic representation, as has been explained, matters for effective stakeholder participation. That without representative democracy aspects being looked at, most of the so-called participatory processes will end up not being able to deliver the aspirations of getting local people or getting lower level voices to influence higher level decisions. The second take-home message is that when we have thought of participation in this way, transaction costs considerations are key, and that we need to make provisions and design our participatory processes in a way that takes care of the transaction costs of representatives being more responsive and more accountable. So we must design program budgets beyond events, costs to taking care of the transaction costs of before and after event issues, and also put in mechanisms that allow representatives to have an engagement with their larger constituencies. Another key message, of course, that has always been emphasized is capacity building for certain categories of stakeholders, the ability to dialogue effectively and to negotiate effectively with other more powerful, so to speak, stakeholders. In most cases, communities and civil society actors may not be very strong in terms of their ability to negotiate and push for their. And these days we hear of the fact that these things have been achieved, that civil society people have become powerful, communities have become powerful. But when you look at it very carefully, these are people who have become more or less elites, representatives of these groups, that they have probably done it over and over, and they have become, as I said, an extension of the public sector, so to speak, and so they have had access to go to conferences and doing this. That capacity has been privatized. It is not a capacity that to some extent has been extended to the larger constituency, to the extent that they are able to participate without such elite. Now, the final thought will be on institutionalizing multi-stakeholder dialogue processes so that we can document the lessons and we can also learn from it. The experience from Ghana is that when different processes come up every day, today it is flex VPA, tomorrow it is red, maybe another day it will be blue or green, all manner of initiatives may come up. And if every initiative will call for multi-stakeholder consultation and dialogue, and we have to set up new systems, in my view, these are not cost-effective ways of doing things. And so we must move towards a situation where multi-stakeholder dialogue will become a cultural kind of, or a structural issue in the sector, that any kind of consultation that has to be made will, jump on that platform. When we do that, we save costs, and that we are also able to maintain certain capacities and able to streamline the internal mechanisms of downward consultation and feedback much more better than we have done. And so on that note, I would like to thank you for listening to me, and I wish you all the best in your deliberations on how to make stakeholder participation more effective in the various processes that we are engaged in. Thank you.